What up, what up, what up? It's your man, Storm P coming in live. This is Storm P Experience. We are back. I am so excited. I have another wonderful, amazing guest. This is an incredible book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics by the attorney, award-winning author, Mark Torres, right? How you doing today?
Sean, I'm doing excellent. Great to be with you today.
Let me do your official introduction, man. Give you a proper props. Today we have the husband, father, attorney, professor, and award-winning author who can shine light over overlooked corners of New York history, from crime novels to Labyrinthine children's stories. The powerful work of nonfiction, his writing both enlightens and entertains. Honored with the prestigious Joseph F. Minnie Award in 2024 for his book, Long Island, Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood. He continues to give voice to stories that demanded to be heard. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sean. And you hit it right there. You know, there's stories that are not either not never told or not told enough. And also from a local perspective, right? Things happen, you read about them, and you kind of hear or see from a global perspective. You know, the goal of my work is to tell it from a local perspective on the spot, and then get that from inwards outwards and tell the story that way.
So I love early in the book, in your acknowledgement section, I try to encourage my guests to always read the entire book, not just the main meat. You mentioned the influence your wife had on your research and your writing. How does your wife influence you and your pen?
Oh, partner in crime, if you will. You know, she really, in fact, in this recent topic with eugenics, she first came across it while we were researching my second book, a fictional book, Adeline. It was set in a mental institution up in Rockland County, New York. And as we were doing the research, we came upon eugenics, which we knew was somewhat of a dark history, but I had really no way to know how deep and complex it was. And we kind of put it in a tank and saved it for later. And we went through. And then throughout the research, I know several times we went to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory to study their archives. And, you know, I didn't know what to expect. We're going to this place where this dark history happened 100 years ago. And we're looking at each other like, what are we walking into? And, you know, just a lot of a fresh perspective, a strong set of eyes, and diligent research. And that's what anyone needs to, you know, multiple sets if you can get them. If you're fortunate enough to have that support system, you know, you take it and you run with it. And I'm blessed to have that, my wife.
So is your wife an author as well?
No, although I often says she should be. She does a lot of writing, journaling. She does a lot of research, extensive, and you know, it's probably like a case of multiple projects for her as opposed to just kind of eventually narrowing down one. And I do hope to get her one day to kind of, you know, author her own work, and maybe we'll work on that.
So with a book like this, heavily sourced, heavy on the notes, the research must have been a lot. So tell us about some of the research process you had in creating a book like this.
Sure, sure. First and foremost, as a lawyer, you know, my goal, even if I wanted to avoid it, I can. I'm trained to cite the facts, to report the facts, to look at evidence, information, supporting information. I would never write or say a source or a statement without having the proper source for that. And really that heavy responsibility carries with me throughout all of my work. This book and this project was challenging. Not It was challenging in one aspect, but there was an abundance of resources there, and that made it a little easier. We went to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories in Long Island, Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Institute, online resources at universities in Missouri, and really several places throughout the country that had a lot of this data at various aspects of this history. That really was my goal, was to kind of put it all together and then tell it in a simplified way, sort of decoding this history. Because if you look at any book on eugenics, it's, you know, it's heavy doses of an almost encyclopedic type storytelling. I wanted to kind of break that down and decode this pseudoscientific movement that really what it was, and a monster movement as it was, and tell it in a more simplified way so that the average layperson can understand it. And to do that, you got to learn it. So it took a while to research, learn, decode, and then write it out in a really formulaic way that people can get.
So I always love to ask the question. Everything can make it into the book because the book could be 1,000 pages long. What's something that's not in the book that you wish would have made the book?
Um, well, yeah, well, you know, I'm never one to add more than necessary. Yeah, there's so much content in this book. I think in hindsight, the more I learn, I'm still doing research on this. The things I've learned post release through lectures and teachings I've given, yeah, it could go more. Maybe now it could be seen more introductory, but man, what an introduction it is! It really is really heavy. Um, Loaded with facts, loaded with data, and also told in a way because it's people just assume you can just tell a story chronologically, time wise. You can, but you can't. And this history was a little bit complex, so it was a matter of really constructing the book and telling it in its own way, compartmentalizing certain aspects of it, the movement, the science, the dramatic impacts to the global influence and international. So it was a really challenging way to get the data, but then tell it in a way that kind of flows.
So for those that are unfamiliar with the term eugenics, uh, maybe it's not used as often in everyday vocabulary lingo. Could you explain to the audience what eugenics is?
Yeah, I mean the word alone was coined by Sir Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin over in England, 19th century. Loosely means well born, and the concept is that human beings can be engineered. Right, we could breed perfect humans like we could breed racehorses or sunflowers. Now, the positive aspects of that sound okay, right? I mean, if we can have children born without disease, without illness, of course everybody would sign up for that and would agree to it. The problem is it can't be done. Secondly, the negative aspects of it are the real, certainly with the dramatic impact of what happened here. Once it fell into the negative hands, because if they can suggest a metric of what everyone should be, what happens for those below the metric? First off, who decides those metrics? And more dangerously, what happens to those below? And that's where the real danger and troubles came from this pseudoscience called eugenics.
So tell us about some of the early founders of eugenics and who are these key figures and what motivated them to push these ideas forward? What was their foundational aim?
Yeah, initially, late 19th century England. I mentioned Sir Francis Galton. I mentioned some other economists, Thomas Malthus, whose theories were there's only so many people who can live on the planet at any given time. Thus, he practiced and argued for strict population control. But largely, over in England and throughout the world, it was mostly theoretical. And just so you know, it also goes back to the ancient Greek, Roman, and Sanskrit texts, right? This idea of making better humans, of engineering humans. But it never really became a practice until early 20th century in America, largely by a man named Charles Benedict Davenport. Born in Connecticut, lived and died on Long Island, maybe 30 miles outside of Manhattan. A Harvard-educated, renowned biologist, and he was so renowned that he was of an era and a leading biologist that gave phenomenal advancements to mankind. That level, cutting edge of biology, he was at the forefront of that. And he comes across, and he's influenced by people um, uh, Darwin's early theories and Galton and others, and the ideas of can we breed these better humans? And he wanted to move from theory to practice. And there's a lot of challenges with that, right? I mean, if humans and scientists study insects and certain animals, the lifespans are shorter. It's a lot easier to kind of do that and spare, but we're talking about the lifespan of human beings. So sooner or later, shortcuts had to have been taken, assumptions had to have been made, and plans had to have been formulated to get this going. And at the front of that and center of that was Charles Davenport.
I want to ask you a question as well. You've been doing book tours and book talks and author talks. What's some of the response from the audience you've been getting back as you're doing these tours? What's some of the feedback?
Yeah, my lectures, I'm often reminded by the publisher that, hey, this is a book, but it's almost more of almost like a lecture, an educational setting. I have devised these lectures that give the facts similar to the way the book's lined out with facts and slides and presentation and content behind the content. And typically, it's often met with horror, shock. People are shocked at the level of and the scope of how this program went well beyond what everyone could have imagined. I mean, dramatic. There are many things that people get wrong that we'll discuss throughout here. but the scope of it, the influence, and really in a relatively short period of time, maybe a 30, 40-year window, to the degree that we're still dealing with these things today. The legacies of eugenics are dramatic. So, people are generally shocked. Another interesting thing about eugenics that's in stark contrast to today was it was really adopted on all sides of the political spectrum. That, although it was started by progressives and the liberal-minded social reform figures, it was adopted on all sides of the political spectrum. And, it's rare to find something so unifying than you can certainly today. But back then, that was such a unifying movement.
Thank you very much for that. Man, tell the audience some of these major like billionaires that was funding this project, like J.D. Rockefeller, I believe, some of these other major names at the time.
Yeah, I mean, nothing happens without money, right? Let's be frank. All of these movements are funded, and this one certainly was well funded. It started at the early local levels by a woman named Mary Harriman. Her husband, E.H. Harriman, was a rich railway mogul up in New York, donated property up in New York State. When he died, she inherited almost $4 billion in today's money, staggering wealth. And she was a staunch supporter of eugenics early on. She donated land and the construction of the eugenics record office at Cold Spring Harbor, and then also at the national level, the Carnegie Institute, later the Rockefellers, poured in lucrative funding to promote not only here but later in Nazi Germany. The kind of movements and the thing about eugenics is that it really was a worldwide, kind of perfected and formulated here in America, and certainly was. But eventually, it caught on throughout the world in many places that people may not think, like Switzerland and Sweden and Finland and other places aside from later Nazi Germany. So certainly the funding was critical, and Davenport even there was a master planner. He organized that. He met Mary Harriman through his daughter, who he was teaching. He was teaching her one of his classes, and she connected them to. They had this dinner in 1910 in New York City. It was a lunch, and no one knows what was said at that meeting, but it was enough said that she agreed to donate lucrative amounts of money and resources for the rest of her life until she passed in 1932. So she really was a main player and funding for the eugenic program.
So tell us about Charles Davenport, who is often seen as the architect of American eugenics.
Yeah.
Who is he, and why was he so pivotal in making it a global idea?
Yeah, the interesting thing about Davenport was there's no, and I'm still astonished, and that may be my next project. There's no published biography on this man. Right? Who was this elusive figure that drove such a brutal policy that many of us can argue still exists today? Again, born in Connecticut, a family man. He had a son, Charlie, who died at 5 years old of polio. By all accounts, a loving, tender man. He grew up in a very strict household. His father was a religious type who, if he said any of his prayers wrong, he was sent to bed without dinner. They worked at a real estate built in Brooklyn, New York, where he'd sweep up the shop, and their source of communication was letter writing. Imagine you're in an office space and you're not talking, you're writing letters to each other. And he started school late. He wrote to his father asking to go to school, and eventually Polytech, and then went on to Harvard. But it took 8 months to get a response. And then once he got that response, he went on, and he had an interesting relationship with his mother. She was more of an educator, more of the natural sciences, agricultural type sciences and zoology. And he more appealed towards that vein than his father's more strict course of teaching. So he was a complex figure that little is known about. I think I'm one of the few in existence now alive that know as much about this elusive yet influential figure that goes on. But Davenport is a really pivotal not only piece of this history, but I would argue in human history, from America all the way throughout the world. So that's worth more exploration, but it's certainly captured in the book as well.
So tell us, how did Davenport, how was he able to have so much influence on these founders? I mean, the funders, the billionaires. How was he able to have these connections and relations, and how did he grow this whole empire?
Yeah, it was almost a perfect storm. If anyone would ever go to Cold Spring Harbor Labs today, which is still there, a sprawling, beautiful campus, you just get pulled by the natural aura of science, right? You just want to grab a magnifying glass and study the leaves and the water, and it's just a beautiful, serene setting. It inspires and invokes science. But early 20th century, by then phrenology was kind of weighing out. They were done measuring skulls, and they wanted to know more. They wanted to know what's in us, what makes us us. Right? What's in our blood, right? DNA. Now they were so far, decades away from figuring it out. It wasn't until, quite frankly, the 60s till they were able to discover the double helix and learn more. But this was an era almost of explorers, great explorers. And the explorers were the scientists. What is in our blood? What makes us us? And Davenport was one of the leading figures in that, where it wasn't just biology, it was more of this internal studies of the blood. And that's what gained way towards the idea of eugenics. And eugenics had an uncanny ability to it ran parallel with many of the social programs of the time, birth control movement, vision, social welfare programs of the time. And those movements borrowed legitimacy from eugenics because it gave this veneer of science that legitimized a lot of the things that may or may not have been either positive or negative thinking, even to the point of it's often been called scientific racism, right? Many of the anti-immigration movement who were staunchly racist and classist and a lot of bigotry and xenophobia, they were able to use science, the science quote unquote of eugenics, to legitimize what they wanted through immigration reform, strict controls, strict laws in the name of that science. So again, it was one of those driving forces that really unified so many movements across all political lines. And again, it gave that veneer of reality. It's like, yeah, we think this, but this science can back this up. And that's why it was so pivotal.
On this show, a lot of writers watch the show. A lot of other people watch the show. I love trying to motivate and inspire them. We talked off the air about it a little bit, but like, tell us, you being an attorney, what impact do you have in that background have on your writing?
Yeah.
And was it difficult to force yourself to write a different way than your everyday
Yeah.
writing?
No, it's a great question, Sean. I'll tell you, initially, my first few works were fictional works. And as a lawyer, you're trained, and people think they watch Law and Order and they think all the dramas in the courtroom, and that's not the case. Lawyering is probably 99% writing, right? From emails to briefs to anything in between, and that's where you earn your craft and your trade. And in that, there's a very strict process, and it's guided by responsibility, ethical writing, telling the truth, despite people saying all these lawyers lie and they bend the truth, but they're trying to find a way to support their arguments. So when I first started writing my first book, A Stirring in the North Fork, in fact, it was a fictional crime novel set out in the East End of Long Island. I wanted to kind of break and have a little fun, loosen up, unbutton the buttons and try to just, write with freedom. But even as I did that, I still kept the ethical responsibility. So I'm writing about fictional stories, granted, but with historical bases. And as I wrote, I was true to those forms. Then when I went back to nonfiction, or went to nonfiction, it kind of blended back, and the responsible ethical writing remained the same. And really, for me, it's the writing is the latter part. It's all about the research. It's getting the data you can't write something competently unless you learn it. So I'm going to take the painful time and experience to study and research and learn it, so that I could talk about it and explain it to others through my writing. And it was kind of this interesting arc that kind of bounced all around and eventually got to where I'm at, where I see it as one and the same. The strict legal writing, but also the freedom to kind of and excitement to tell the story, if you will, good or bad. But the importance of the story is what matters.
And so, about how many years did it take you to create this book? Like from the idea to the research to the actual literal writing process?
Yeah, this probably took 2.5 to 3 years of research. And if you know me, Sean, that's a long time. But it deserved that much attention. And I'll also credit my wife again, because I'm a labor attorney. I come from these different backgrounds. And picking up this stuff, this scientific genetics, I'm like, this isn't my alley. Why am I here? And I almost walked away. It was quite intimidating, quite daunting. And she urged me to stay on. It's a people story. It's important. And the more I agreed with that, and I stuck with it. And the more I realized that, yeah, it's a people story. And it was almost by design to be hard. Leave it to the experts. And I refused to follow that path. And so I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to learn it, decode it, and then write it. And I'm so glad I did, because now I'm becoming this, this voice, a modern voice about this past history that has modern implications.
So you mentioned your wife more than one time already. What did your wife think when you finally got the box in the mail? I got the book in my hand.
Yeah.
What did your wife think?
Well, she was thrilled, as my children, Isabella, Jake, and Olivia. They were thrilled. In some ways, it's a collective effort. Everybody puts in. They put up and tolerate me locking myself up and doing my research and going out and doing these things. They support it in a lot of different ways. They even help with the tech part if I'm going on these interviews and lectures. You know, everybody's chipping in here, and it's a great group effort to put it out. And really, you know, it's necessary. This is very complex history, complex stuff we're navigating through. And again, it deserves the attention and the slow methodical process of getting it all together.
See, my background is psychology, right?
Yep.
Let's talk about intelligence tech, because I even learned in school myself. A lot of the founding fathers of psychology were not the best human beings either, but they made these intelligence tests that we still use to this day. Tell us about some of the background of intelligence tests and some of those things.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you brought that up, Sean. And I'll tell you, years ago, like today, people use words like moron, idiot, imbecile as common insults. But back then, 100 years ago, these were common eugenic terms. They were medical diagnoses. And if you were declared any of these, you were in trouble. You would be dealt with harshly and harsh eugenic measures, from being locked up or sterilized or worse. These were dramatic times. And you know, eugenicists were looking to build a science, right? You can't just snap your fingers and say we have a science. So one of it was, of course, getting these questionnaires, going out and talking to prisoners, patients, and all the, you know, everyone in between to trip them up, to get them the answers so that you have your narrative, which is already drafted and complete, to support it. But IQ test was important because it gave another tool to catch a lot of people in mass a lot faster. And I'll give you an example. In 1917, Henry Goddard, who was a close ally and associate of Charles Davenport, he devised an English version of the Binet-Simon intelligence test. And this test, you know, had a lot of complex questions. So they went in 1917, they went to all the U.S. military bases. And all of these reserves were farm boys. They were people who didn't have schooling, training. They were just drafted and they went in the military. So they would give them these IQ tests, and they would ask questions like about fine art and technological questions about motor vehicles and cars. And they had no way of knowing the answers. You know, in fact, some of these questions people would get wrong today. But when you got them wrong, they would mark you accordingly to judge your, quote, intelligence. Based on those findings of that test in 1917, they declared that half of 1.7 million Army recruits were declared morons eugenically. And what the eugenicists did was pounce on that, fearmonger, or we're falling behind the curve. Look how dangerous this is. We need to do something, and eugenics is the way. So, you know, it was a mixture of these methodologies and practices in science, but it was also this propaganda and movement and at a remarkable pace in an era where information was at a minimum. You know, today we pick up a phone, we have computers, we have access. Back then, the information was at a premium, the newspapers, public word, or public speeches. And when people are seeing the level of how everyone is buying into this eugenics and this movement, how else would you not be swayed? It was a dramatic, really American, certainly worldwide propaganda movement, the likes of which has hardly ever been seen.
Us knowing this history of these tests, things of that nature, how do you think it still has legs now? Like all
Yeah.
these years later, we know this stuff. We still use these tests and these standardized. Why do we still use it?
Yeah, it's troubling and dangerous. And even today, I mean, certain testings for some disabilities are very similar to the testings back in the 1920s and 30s in eugenics programs. SATs, you know, how do we quantify intelligence? Do we say by a number how you did on a test? You know, I know many people who are not book smart, but they can build things with their hands like the purest artisanal or artisan you'll ever see. People have different strengths and weaknesses. And the thing about eugenics is they had no tolerance for that. It was either you were here or you weren't. And the here was the level they set. And typically it was racist and classist, and everybody was below the curve, unless there was some kind of reasoning for it. And I'll give you an example. So we talk about the in the book, it talks a lot about these questionnaires that people would be asked, and they would be marked accordingly. Now, Adolf Hitler was avid about eugenics. He heard about this and learned about the American program, and he was all in. He told a confidant that if his own mother was given one of these eugenic questionnaires, he was pretty sure he would not have been born, meaning she would have been sterilized because eugenics would have said this woman is below the cut and should not have children. Imagine that, right? On one hand, he knew the fallacy of it, but also the danger of it. But of course, being who he was and being on the strong side and the safe side, you can advocate for this kind of movement. So it just shows how wide sweeping this really was.
And you mentioned us having so much technology information now, but at the same time, it's like talk about how statistics could be skewed,
Yeah,
how data could be skewed.
sure.
You see a post with a bunch of graphs and charts on it, you just share it, you just regurgitate it in the barbershop, but like even with all the stuff in front of you, you still cannot see what you actually supposed to see if you don't know any better. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and quite frankly, I mean, that's what makes human beings special, right? Collectively, to suggest that you have to be at a certain IQ range or certain academic level range, that's a fallacy. There are many people, even with people with disabilities, who may struggle in things that people may see as easy or normal, but they have abilities well beyond what the normal people have, and that confounds scientists, the same scientists who study them. So, there really is many ways to determine the special nature of human beings. And again, think, movements in science like eugenics was dangerous because it had no tolerance for that. It was what they determined they could prove, and anything below could not continue.
Well, let's get to this part that many folks might not know. How did American eugenics shape and influence Nazi Germany policy during the 1930s, 1940s, and how much of their methodology came directly from U.S. practice?
Yeah, one of the first major misconceptions in this history is that the Nazis got a hold of this and somehow started it in American. It is completely opposite. And I'll take you back first, Sean, to 1911. In 1911, Davenport and his ilk and all of these leading thinkers of the time started having these regular meetings in Manhattan, the City Club in New York City, 45th Street. And they were kicking around these ideas on how to really move eugenics. What is our goal here? By 1914, they came up with a plan. And we know what the plan is because they put it in writing. And all these records are there to support this. And they came up with a 10-part plan to deal with 15 million Americans, 10% of the U.S. population. They call them the submerged 10, right? These are the 10% population dragging us down from being the master race. This is 1914, right? I'll remind you. So flash forward this to the Nazis uprising. And even prior to that, a lot of the eugenicists were fully on board in Nazi Germany and connected with Long Island. And, they kind of kicked these ideas around and promoted it and shared it and supported each other. But when you put this dangerous science in the hands of this murderous regime, without any guardrails like a constitution or just moral decency, that's where the danger was truly shown. And then the Nazis pounced on this. And even before the Holocaust, in 1936, I'll tell you, Harry Laughlin, who was really second in command behind Charles Davenport, he was kind of his henchman, if you will, in some ways. He received in 1936 a letter. He got a letter from Heidelberg University in Germany. And the school was celebrating its 550th anniversary. It was a big jubilee. Worldwide people were coming. And now Laughlin couldn't attend. He couldn't travel at the time, but he thankfully accepted the honorary degree. This was 1936, and the man who sent them that letter was a man named Carl Schneider. He was the dean of the school. 3 years later, Carl Schneider led the Nazi T4 program. If you haven't heard of it, the Nazi T4 program, they lethally gassed 70,000 German men, women, and children, and not because they were Jewish, not because of any other than they were deemed eugenically unfit. It's called the first Nazi genocide. And it was based on eugenics. And they did this on their own people at the time, from people who were sick, deformed, disabled. They killed them. And they killed them the same way they would later do in the Holocaust. The fake showers. They created these fake ashes and death reports to the families. It was quite traumatic. And that's the kind of influence that the Nazis had from the Americans. In fact, one last point I'll add. In the Nuremberg trials after the war, Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal doctor, he testified that you're coming after us, you're prosecuting us, but in America, three decades early, you had your own people calling for mass murder, mass euthanasia, mass terror. What is so different than what we've done? And he also cited the infamous Buck v. Bell case, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, which guaranteed the state, in this case, the state of Virginia, to forcefully sterilize a woman against her will. And it shows vividly the connection between, and beyond connection, the influence and direct influence from the American eugenic program to the Nazi regime.
And let's go full circle. You give us the history on this. So whenever the war concludes, doesn't some of the Nazi Germany scientists and doctors come over here to the
Sure.
U.S. and help the U.S.?
Yeah, many of them did. They were kind of divvied up between U.S. and Russia. Some of the Nazi scientists winded up over in Long Island, East Coast, Plum Island. Had done some biological warfare testings there. It's very shady, and these kind of laboratories throughout the country. Sure, they wanted to catch up and get a leg up on the science, if you will, the technology. People who really led the Nazi eugenic programs never really faced justice. A lot of them escaped justice and got away with it. One of them, by the way, was Joseph Mengele, who was an assistant to one of the leading eugenicists in Germany, Otto von Verscher. He escaped justice. He fled and got away, and eventually died, and never faced justice for his horrific crimes. So yeah, full fledged. And then, quite frankly, when these atrocities were coming out, the Carnegies and the funding, they couldn't ignore it anymore, right? It was bad for business. It looked bad. It was bad. So once the funding dried up and the program stopped, the movement just kind of never really went away. It was underground, but it was still around, but it didn't have the force that it did as a fully functional, above board operation. And again, ultimately, eugenics was never a science. It was a social philosophy. So you could shut down a building, but you can't shut down a social philosophy. And that's, sadly, you can see that in many things today.
You just said shut down a building. Tell us about Cold Spring Harbor, right? And like, why was Long Island like? I would say, I guess the key place for this whole thing to like be an incubator.
Yeah.
What about Long Island in this area made it so like I guess perfect conditions?
Sure. And I'll tell you, just as a side fact, it was good. It was almost going to be Woods Hole, Massachusetts, the middle of nowhere. But its proximity to New York City, it's closest to funding. Cold Spring Harbor itself is a magnificent natural, scientific, scenic location, and still is today. It was a former whaling port, flora, fauna, beautiful area, and they could do a lot of these studies. And when the Carnegies came in, and the idea of this, experimental evolution, these ideas, again, what makes us us? It was the hub, and it became the hub for many years. But ironically, the Eugenics Record Office itself, and you'll hear that and see it throughout the book, it really was just a 2.5-story building, an unassuming building, which, by the way, still exists today. It's a private home. And you would look at it and you would say, well, what was how did this little building have so much influence? And ideally, what it was a data collection center. It was the hub of this building the science and data and amplifying it. So they would have these training programs, and they would train these college graduated, mostly women from Cornell and upstate colleges, and they would come in and train them as field agents. And they would go out across the country, Native American reservations, Coney Island sideshow, so-called freak shows, prisons, mental institutions, with all these questionnaires and get all this data and bring it back. And they would store these cards, mostly cards, in these specialized fireproof cabinets, state of the art for this time. And they're building up millions and millions of these documents and records and data. And now you could say, or they did say, they have a full-fledged science that they could support with the data. And of course, it was biased, it was flawed, it was misleading, it was judgmental, it was assumptions, it was anything but true science, certainly not tested. They also ran a publication called Eugenical News. It was sort of like this quarterly publication where they would get from all over the world interesting new tidbits about eugenics in Finland and eugenics in Germany and America. They'd put it all together, compile it in a quarterly publication, and send it out to the world. I liken it to Twitter of the time, right? And all things eugenics. Look for that pamphlet, that handout, and you can still see a lot of these records online and these days. And some of it's dry and bland, but you can see a lot of the movement. The mainstay was the promotion of eugenics, the legitimizing of eugenics. So you have this hub, like you said, this beacon, this place that that supported it with science through the data, and also amplified it back out to the world through a massive propaganda movement. And it was really a remarkable achievement on their part, and it influenced national policy. It influenced murderous regimes like the Nazis, and really just led to just true calamity that one of the most damaging things in the 20th century, and still continues.
So within your research process and traveling, I'm sure, and going different places, were you able to visit that actual location?
That's well, the house itself, again, it's a private home. I know where it is. I never share it publicly. I'm sure the people who live there may or may not know, but it's a home, right? It's not as if there's hauntings and scars, although it has a lot of influence and power. But Cold Spring Harbor itself, which is right down the road, is still there. It's still a thriving labs, genetic research. They do some amazing work and have done amazing work. But really, that was the hub. That was the area that started it. This kind of little village type area for academics and science and nature, and just building off that. And again, if you go there, and I'll tell you, Davenport himself is still revered there. His old home, his Victorian home, is still there. It's used to house visiting students and faculty. But in the libraries, there's a bust of him, and he is noted for other works of science and achievements for science. Unfortunately, and in my view, and I think many others who study this history, his work for eugenics clearly, is what he's going to be known for, and what, quite frankly, he should be known for. He had more than enough ample time to back out and say, "Wait a minute, maybe we're going the wrong path here." But he never did do that, and he continued on believing in this and promoting this until his death in 1944.
So I want to speak on the university aspect. It was something in your book to see like how many classes were taught with a eugenics foundation, or like how many books was written at that time about eugenics. And then you go into, like you
Yeah.
said, periodicals, newspapers, even other parts of life. So where it was just really just gaining traction. Talk about that.
Yeah, and thank you, Sean. And that actually leads to probably the second largest misconception of eugenics. I think, and I certainly did, people have the belief that eugenics was maybe some quackery, marginalized a few people. Completely the opposite. I actually call it the rage of the age. Eugenics was taught in 300 colleges in the United States, including Harvard, Yale, NYU, all the big Ivy Leagues. It was supported by every president, from Hoover to Wilson. It was remarkable, and of course all political lines. Supported by Supreme Court justices, by medical professionals, businesses, commercial advertising. It goes down the gamut of just a remarkable embracing of what they thought was the sign, of the science. And again, I call it this rage of the age, because it really was promoted and sought after by so many. Popular culture. There was a film, The Black Stork. It was a silent film. It was a eugenic cautionary tale on, a doctor counseling a couple to not have a child because it would likely be defective based on eugenics. That film ran in theaters for 10 consecutive years. 10 years. You can probably still find it on YouTube. Fitter family contest, right? Midwest, people would gather and dress up in their best attire. They would get tested and measured. And the ones who won the fittest family, they would get these awards and governor's trophies. It was a hugely, fiercely competitive contest. World Fair exhibits, 1915, the World's Fair in California, San Francisco. 18 million people visited the eugenic exhibit over a 9-month period. Hugely popular. And again, I mentioned before, from every president, from Roosevelt to Herbert Hoover, were not only supported eugenics, but openly were part of eugenic groups, fully endorsed and signed legislation, anything pertaining to eugenics. So it gives you the idea that eugenics was not this fringe, marginalized bunch of quacks. Eugenics was the rage of the age, and it was dangerous, prevalent, and it was just as much part of America as baseball and apple pie.
So we see in today's political climate, a lot of talk about immigration is such a major topic. But in your book, you show us how far back that conversation really goes. Some of the major U.S. players played a huge part in harmful ideas and rhetoric against immigration. Can you break the history down for us?
Yeah. Obviously, anti-immigration fervor is high, and it's been high in this country for many periods. And at that time in the 1920s and prior, it was high as well. And that was part of the eugenicist goals, but also anti-immigration, to merge these two movements together. And Harry Laughlin, again, the understudy of Charles Davenport, was influential. He was appointed this eugenic expert. He testified by Congress, and he drafted these extremely racist, xenophobic reports, and really influenced Congress to pass these dramatic anti-immigration laws. One of the men leading behind that was a man named Madison Grant, a lawyer, zoologist, conservationist, and he was also a staunch eugenicist. And he wrote a book, an extremely racist book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. In that book, he argued that the white race was under attack, and he railed against all races coming into the country, Jews, Poles, Italians, Irish, anyone across the board that wasn't white. And he railed against that. That book was cited by Hitler. Hitler called that book his Bible. That's how influential that was towards that. But when you put these forces, this fierce anti-immigration fervor and forces with this eugenic movement, I mean, they were a perfect match. And they were able to get this legislation passed that shut the border down, mostly from Eastern European countries, by 97%. And it was supposed to be a few years. It lasted at least 30 years. So it was quite dramatic on how it moved lawmakers, who, by the way, did not have to be moved much. I mean, they were at the chambers of Congress reading passages from that book, The Passing of the Great Race, and the Jewish members of Congress were flabbergasted and distraught about having to hear these extremely racist readings, and they were just drowned out by the overwhelming majority and the constituency, and the people followed. And another aspect that eugenicists use, and this goes back to 18th century England with the poor laws, right? The idea was, it's expensive as a country to pay for prisons and mental asylums, but yet it's also expensive if you don't handle these problems, right? So what these forces would do would whip up the public against each other. Your tax dollars are paying for these people. Let them do it themselves. And you're whipping, and you're really putting people against each other. And those of power and influence and the riches were really enjoying this and really orchestrating this to those levels. So when you make that economic argument that eugenics is needed because we're spending too much money on people who should not be born and should not have children and should not continue the problem. So again, it was another factor and force that it was led to this ultimate program.
Throughout your book, you show how prisons and lower class population were often a target for experiments and like data collection. Give us some of this horrendous history on like how they use these certain populations of people that are kind of underprivileged, under cared for population for
Sure.
their experiments.
Yeah, and there were many poorhouses then, of course, mental asylums and prisons. And many would think, like in today's world, right? We have privacy laws, we have HIPAA, and back then they had no real privacy laws. But even more so, Davenport and his team was so revered that he had free access and reign to go to any of these facilities. He struck up these connections with, Catherine Bennett Davis, the first female who was running the New York prison systems. Many of these administrators in these mental asylums who were also eugenicists, they were more than eager to help and say, come on in, study the prisoners, look at the records, do what you need to do, and let's all get this, moving forward for the greater good, to the greater of our race and our society and our nation. And they had full access for that. And they exploited. Eugenicists saw poverty as somehow a poor hereditary trait. Of course, any mental illness or any, they had a term called feeble-minded, right? Feeble-minded combined mental deficiency if you had it, but also combined it with immorality. So if a young woman was seen as promiscuous, or a boy or woman was, maybe they weren't so proficient academically, but they were good with their hands and building and sewing and all the things they could do, they were seen as less deserving and poor traits. And I'll give you another example. If you take a married couple, if the father was known as a pickpocket and the mother, say, was known to be a prostitute or alleged to be a prostitute, eugenicists would automatically theorize that their children would automatically be the same way. Meanwhile, these are socioeconomic factors that could have led to the husband being a thief and the wife being a prostitute. But they ignored that. They completely ignored it because they wanted to force the science, the narrative that those are poor traits and poor genes and that cannot continue to infect or lessen the pool of the greater good. They call it germplasm, and these kind of technical terms and scientific terms to label the early DNA, things that they didn't really understand yet, but profess to do.
Now, anybody watching this podcast might think, well, this is all very, very old stuff, right? But we know um, some prisons are still doing like forced sterilizations. They're still conducting experiments unbeknownst to the prisoners and things like that. Like, talk about how prevalent this stuff is still going on. It's not
Yeah.
like it's just some past history.
Now this is it. Thank you, Sean. Eugenics was fully debunked by the mid 1940s. No, not a science. The gene code wasn't cracked until the 60s. But today, 31 U.S. states have statutes allowing for forced sterilization. 31 under certain circumstances. U.S. prison systems, the judges have offered reduced sentencing if inmates agreed to be sterilized, as if somehow they're less dangerous because they're sterilized. 2022, the Netherlands became the first country to allow doctors to euthanize patients. Now Canada and even some U.S. states have it, and there's other countries adopting it. And while there are strict guardrails, I will grant you that, the fear is, what if those guardrails get weaker and lessen, and more people are dying, and people who propose to want to promote eugenics or eugenic thinking say we'd rather get rid of these people. So let's let these guardrails weaken so those people can kill themselves and be euthanized. 2023, the FDA approved research for companies to develop artificial wombs, which can be monitored from a smartphone. And the quest is to have perfect babies. Now, I don't make any I don't question or judge the legitimacy of this, but I wonder, what is a perfect baby first? But more importantly, are we going to fall back into this? What if those aren't perfect based on this technology? What happens? You think of modern, even the modern current administration and Robert F. Kennedy to talk of gaining a list of autistics throughout the nation. Now, on one hand, I understand the argument that a lot of the families are keeping that private, and that's what the laws are for, right? HIPAA. So they're having a hard time getting this studies going. But you can't create a list and get around these privacy laws, because back in the 20s, eugenicists wanted to do that with the blind people in this country. Get a list, make a national list of all the blind people. And I promise you, the intentions there were not good. The idea of floating around more money to have more children. And the Nazi Lebensborn project in the 40s was just like that. They promoted more people to have more children so they can grow this Aryan nation faster. The danger's there. Just last week, Brian Kilmeade on Fox News, he talked about euthanizing homeless people and mentally ill people. He later apologized, which was encouraging to hear. But when I heard that, and I know, knowing this history and as I studied it, that's dramatically dangerous and very no longer reminiscent of back then, the same as back then.
Now, one of your more mind-boggling parts of the book to me was figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Helen Keller were supporters of eugenics.
Yeah.
Tell us
And most
about their
people,
involvement and why they aligned themselves with such kind of thinking.
when I first learned that, I was shocked like you were. Since and ongoing my research, I'm getting less and less surprised, because again, eugenics was so prominent then that it would have surprised me that, because again, of the time, whether you wanted to believe it or were tricked into believing it, almost everyone was on board with eugenics. So I'm less shocked now by it, but it is an interesting point. Helen Keller, when eugenicists made this list of 10 groups that they wanted to target, that submerged 10th I mentioned before, the 15 million Americans, on that list was people with poor defective sensory organs, the blind, deaf, and mute. Helen Keller herself. Now, on one hand, we could say, well, how do we judge a woman who's lived a life like this and saying others shouldn't live in the way I've lived? Maybe that's so. I can't speak to that. But are you really going to promote a program that's going to deny people the right to progeny, the right to live peacefully and make choices of family? That to me is harsh. W.E.B. Du Bois, he talked about the talented 10th. He talked about this promotions. But what about the other 90% that wouldn't be so, quote, talented? People of color who are certainly targeted. And I'll add one thing on this, too. We talk eugenicists, as much as it was race, it was just as much class. Eugenicists talked about extremely racist toward white people as well. They talk about the shiftless whites in the South, the degenerate whites in upstate New York. To them, race was a factor as well, but it was just as much class. And if you were poor, if you were homeless, if you were, had these poor hereditary traits, they wanted you gone just as well. So it really was across the board on that. that the way the eugenicists saw the world.
So about a year ago, I had a genealogist on the show. We had a great podcast. But I asked her about you a sports guy, you told me. Seeing today's athletes, and we know certain sport dads, they purposely pick the mother of their child, trying to create a superstar athlete.
Yeah.
Certain Super Bowl champions, NBA champions, NFL guys, their dad is on interviews talking openly about, man, I picked the mother because she was 6 feet tall and she had these. What are your thoughts about that in the
Yeah, I
conversation?
mean, you know what it is, and that's the danger of us, humans. We tend to play God, right? We tend to think that we can orchestrate, engineer, arrange something so perfect in our favor. I mean, I suppose, and I'm not a geneticist, so I couldn't weigh in on if a parent is tall and muscular. Both parents are. Maybe the son, the child would likely be tall and muscular. I don't weigh in on that, but it's superficial. It's appearance, right? What lies beyond those appearances? And then, for that matter, if the child was born and say they're not tall and muscular, does that mean they're less deserving or less special or have less offered things to offer the world? And that's where the danger is. We have these ideals, perfect children, perfect people. Well, what makes it perfect, and who determines that? And that's where the trouble, where we fall in it as human beings, in this playing God mentality. And I'll tell you, we talked about Davenport a lot, and I can tell you in 1929, he arranged a special meeting in Rome, Italy. And the oldest capital of the world, they called it, and all eugenicists delegates from each country attended. They all got together and they said, all right, here's our plan, guys. We want to create a world map of the defectives in each country. So at the time, Davenport, so they're each identifying the location, the kinds of people, indigenous populations. Davenport actually mentioned the high tuberculosis rates in Virginia at the time, as right now the leading group that has, and this is a hit list, right? This is a kill list. This is a way to kind of, and not just locally, but internationally. And their mission was to go back and influence their legislatures to pass these laws based on eugenics, that we could eventually get all of these people in all of these pockets of each of countries and get rid of them. And again, then the ocean of, we know better. What if they're less than us? And ironically enough, Harry Laughlin, who was second in command, spent most of his career rooting out epilepsy. His goal was searching for these people with epilepsy. It was later discovered that he himself was an epileptic. He kept it a secret, of course, never told anyone. The hypocrisy. And that's the thing about the sad nature sometimes of humans, where as long as I'm on the safe side of things, I could turn my back on those who aren't. Even if it's my race, my culture, my stature in life, my profession, or whatever. Me and mine are good. Forget about them. And too many people do that, and that's why we fall into these dangerous lapses throughout human history. That hypocrisy, the self-preservation, the I'm good, you're out.
I read this other book a long time ago. I can't think of the name of it, but it was about chess. And again, this mother and father on purpose, they had three children trying to create like this grand master chess player.
Yeah.
So every child they tried certain things and certain practices. And let's say the child made it to a certain level of success, we gotta do it again. They would have another child, did it 3 times.
Yeah.
Trying to create this grand master chess person. It's crazy.
Yeah. We mentioned the sports analogy, and I can think of many, say in football, quarterbacks, they have the physical acumen, big arm, strong, the high football IQ. But what about injuries? Maybe they're prone to injuries. You can't forecast that. What if they buckle under pressure? You can't forecast that. Even in football, in fact, they have the Wonderlic test, which they give all these quarterbacks. It's sort of an IQ test in real time. And purportedly, the higher the rating is, the better you'll be. I mean, does that mean you're not going to be great if you don't do well in that exam? It's kind of these metrics, these arbitrary metrics set up sadly for the worst of reasons.
Well, you put a lot of time and study and work on this book. It just came out this year. Go out there and get the publication, people. But what's next on the horizon for you? What's some of the next topics you're curious about and researching, writing about? Maybe what's coming up next?
Yeah, I'm promoting a podcast. I'm trying to promote a podcast, as well as trying to curate an exhibit at a local historical society or museum here on Long Island. Kind of a replication of the Eugenics Record Office, along with these panels with information. Um, I'm teaching a course at Hofstra University, at University of Long Island, on eugenics and the working class, which has never been told from that specific angle, and that's been really challenging but exciting, and to kind of teach the young minds about this history is important. And I'm also really eager to promote this to a film, and I don't not mean a documentary, although I'd be pleased with the documentary. I really see the potential here of a feature film on someone like Charles Davenport, a biopic surrounded by this history. This man was so influential. And if we think eugenics is dangerous, think about the person who drove it. And so little is known about him that I think it's so right for a feature film. And like you said, we were talking earlier, Sean, a lot of people don't have time to read. They check out, they kind of maybe they'll listen to podcasts or audio books, or, maybe they just want to watch TV and relax and unwind. That's all fine. But you put a compelling film and a teachable moment and people in front with the popcorn and the entertainment and the relaxing, you could reach a lot of minds there. And really, the goal of my work is to teach, to have public discourse. We can't walk this back. This history can't be unwound. Millions were killed, millions were sterilized, millions were imprisoned. We can't bring that back. The Carnegie Institute in 2020 issued a public apology. They dropped it on their website in the summer of June 2020. No public statement. But some states even had reparations bills for people who were sterilized. Most people died already, but you can't bring it back. There's no way to kind of get a reckoning for this. The only thing I can see is to teach it, talk about it, and share it, and make sure it don't happen again. And really watch for the warning signs. And really, as much as it was across the line politically then, it's the same way now. My goal is to unite and talk on all sides and share this history for the rightest of reasons.
I spoke on being also specializing with the labor force and being a labor man. Before we get out of here, what are some of your thoughts on all this talk about AI technology, and we see the loss of jobs,
Yeah.
jobs dipping and employment dipping, and see what's going on with that. What's your thoughts about that topic?
And part of what worries me is the intimidation of the technology itself. Much like eugenics, people were just afraid to touch it. Too complex, leave it to the experts. I myself have an intimidating as a way I approach just looking at AI and trying to understand it more. It almost intimidates me away from wanting to look into this and understand the horrors. Obviously, anything that's going to replace human judgment and compassion and excellence is a dangerous thing. It's funny you mentioned labor, and we talk about the minimum wage, which is a great thing for people, but you may not know, and your viewers may be shocked to find out that eugenicists were also behind the minimum wage. Now, when I learned this, I almost fell off the chair, Sean. I said, how can this be? How can minimum wage, which helps so many people, how can it be how can this sinister group of eugenicists be behind it? Well, here's what they did. They believed that people who had poor traits would work for anything. They would work for low wages, and they would cut out the seasoned, skillful other workers. So they created minimum wage to have those skilled workers work there. And the others, who they called unemployables, the millions, they would be easier to kind of keep out of their work pool, segregate them, sterilize them, or worse. It was a matter of control. So, Genesis had a big part in the formulation of minimum wage, and it just shows how deep their stuff went. And that's the dangers of it. And that's why, again, for labor, anything that replaces human judgment, even think about sports. We talk back on that with video replay, and, maybe for certain things that, all right, to the naked eye, it could be right or could be wrong. Replay will get it right. But, you don't want it to supplant, human judgment, a ball or a strike, a goal or a touchdown. You want to have certain things and leave that to the human judgment for better or worse, right? And that's what makes humanity there. We're not perfect, but we're humans and we want to make it right. We don't want technology to replace that.
Well, thank you very, very much for your time. You poured in a lot. Anybody watching this in the future, leave some comments. I love having comments and interaction. It's been a wonderful show. It's an amazing book. Go out there and get it. Where you find your local books, go out there and get this book, please. Paperback, Kindle, you name it. Go out there and get it. Anybody watching on Monday, my next episode is on Monday. with Professor Lindsay Stewart on her book called The Black Conjure Women. It's going to be another amazing show. Tap in, subscribe to the channel, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
All right, I hit the end button.